Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression, the Faculty of Communication Design and Ryerson University, I'd like to welcome you to what I think is going to be a very interesting discussion this evening. The Center is really pleased to be able to host the speakers I'm going to introduce in a moment. And I'd like to formally thank the CBC and CBC Ideas for co-sponsoring this event with us. And subsequently, CBC Ideas will be broadcasting a program based on the presentation you're going to hear tonight. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression. Tonight's panel is the 10th in the Center's current series of public discussions of key issues related to freedom of expression and the public's right to know. And did you hand out the upcoming events? Okay. We have a list of the upcoming events in April and May, if you're interested. And the Center for Free Expression's website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca, is a wonderful source of information, blogs, and news about free expression. And if you'd like to receive any notices of our future events over the coming year or two, there's also some clipboards that are going to be going around where you can just put your name and email address on, and we'll send you the information. Tonight's panel is being live streamed and will be available on the Center's website and our YouTube channel, as are all the podcasts of our previous events. So it's my pleasure now to introduce this distinguished panel. Now, you're probably used to people doing introductions to referring to whomever they're introducing as distinguished. This time it's actually true. The first panelist is Sandy Boucher, sitting immediately next to me. Sandy is a seasoned investigator with 33 years experience in both public and private sectors. Starting his career in the Royal Hong Kong Police, where he worked for 12 and a half years, attaining the rank of superintendent, Sandy specialized in Asian organized crime, narcotics, and money laundering investigations. During his time with the force, Sandy received both commissioners and commanding officers' commendations for his work, as well as commendations from 8 overseas police forces. Sandy came to Canada in 1995, working in the private sector. He is a specialist in fraud and corruption investigations, background due diligence inquiries, asset tracing and recovery, and managing major investigations in security. He now works primarily on detecting and preventing fraud, corruption, and divides his time between investigating such cases and advising organizations on how to prevent them from occurring. Since 2009, Sandy has worked in the forensic group of Grant Thornton LLP, where he heads the National Investigative Research and Anti-Corruption Practices. He has also worked with many whistleblowers and has managed a number of complex investigations stemming from whistleblower complaints. Sandy is also on the Grant Thornton Confidential Anonymous Reporting for Employees, the acronym is CARE, team. Our second panelist next to Sandy is David Hutton. David is an advocate for whistleblower protection as a means of safeguarding the public interest and the integrity of our institutions. He has worked for what was the principal whistleblower organization in Canada, the Federal Accountability Initiative for Reform, its acronym is FAIR, a charity devoted to whistleblower protection. For almost a decade, David was active in FAIR. He's serving as chair of the board and then subsequently as executive director for 6 years. David has written and spoken about whistleblowing, published analyses of Canadian whistleblowing laws, lamentable as they are. Is that fair? Maybe I should. Don't want to preempt what you're going to say. And their implementation, or lack thereof, and created guidance materials for whistleblowers. He is also an author and former management consultant, recognized as an expert in management systems and organizational change. During his career, he served as a senior executive in industry, led a successful consulting practice for 20 years, worked with clients around the world, and published 2 authoritative books on quality management that have been translated, published, and distributed on 4 continents. David is also a senior fellow of the Center for Free Expression. Our third panelist is Anna Myers. Anna is a lawyer, UK lawyer, I guess officially, who was originally trained and called to the bar in Canada. She was Deputy Director of Public Concern at Work, the organization that led the UK whistleblower protection law onto the statute books, and then worked at the Government Accountability Project, GAP, in Washington, D.C. GAP is the principal whistleblower protection organization in the United States, set up in 1977 to defend whistleblowers in response to several prominent whistleblower cases like that of Daniel Ellsberg. Anna has also advised hundreds of individuals on their whistleblowing concerns, trained senior executives and policymakers in public and private sectors on embedding sensible whistleblowing arrangements to support open and accountable workplaces and to protect society. She's also advised numerous governments on whistleblowing law and practice. While she has worked on major international standard-setting legal instruments and guidance on the protection of public interest whistleblowers for the United Nations, for the OECD, and the Council of Europe, her passion is really working with civil society organizations. Since 2013, Anna has run Whistleblowing International Network, WIN, which was co-founded by 5 of the world's leading whistleblower protection NGOs. WIN now boasts over 60 member organizations and associates from 33 countries. WIN's mission is to strengthen civil society capacity to protect public interest whistleblowers worldwide by sharing legal and technical expertise across borders. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Paul Kennedy. Many of you will be familiar with him and his mellifluous voice that you will hear regularly on CBC Ideas. Paul has been the host of CBC Ideas since 1999, when he succeeded the legendary Lister Sinclair. But Paul's association with the program actually goes back many years before that, almost 30 years, to 1977. That year he made his first contribution to Ideas, a documentary called The Fur Trade Revisited. Paul didn't do academic work on the fur trade sitting in his office in Toronto, but rather took a 1,600-kilometer journey paddling down the Mackenzie River from Great Slave Lake to the Arctic Ocean. Paul's interests encompass the environment, sport, travel, food, music, art, and biography. I guess you have to be sort of a Renaissance person to be the host of Ideas, given the diversity of issues that program deals with. His work engages what he describes as the core curriculum of contemporary culture. Paul has won national and international recognition for his work, including an ACTRA Award for the Best Canadian Radio Documentary for a program called War on the Home Front that he co-authored with Timothy Finley, the B'nai B'rith Media Human Rights Award for a series called Nuremberg on Trial, an Armstrong Award presented by Columbia University, and in 2005, he was awarded the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution Special Citation for excellence in ocean science journalism for his 8-part series, Learning from the Oceans. I mean, a remarkable range of work for one person to do. Paul has a BA from Queen's University and MLit from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. He did postgraduate work at the University of Toronto, where he studied with the legendary Marshall McLuhan. Please join me in welcoming this remarkable panel.
Thanks, Jim. I want to actually begin by not necessarily sloughing off the great compliments you paid me, and I think the other panelists actually deserve what you said about them. But I want to say actually how pleased I am, how grateful I am for the opportunity that the Center for Free Expression has given me and Ideas to come into a setting like this to talk about topics like we'll be talking about tonight. This is the second time we've made an appearance here in this way, and I hope it is no longer the beginning, but is the second step on a journey that will continue for a long while. Because it strikes me that our goals in some ways mesh almost perfectly. We're a radio program, but we're very much interested in not public education, but public awareness, in helping people to be able to deal with a world that is, I have to say, increasingly complex. Once upon a time as a young man, maybe I thought that there would be progress towards understanding and perhaps not making things more simple, but making them more understandable. And I have to confess that at this stage of my life, I'm beginning to think that all such hopes must be abandoned now, and we have to look at different ways to try to make sense of the world we live in. That being said, again, it is a great pleasure to be here and an honor to be part of what is obviously a very amazing series. The things you said about the panelists are all true, were all true. I've done some research on it myself, and none of those seem to be anything that anyone should blow a whistle about. These people have all done honorable, good work, virtuous deeds, I would say, and they wear their CVs literally with them as they move around doing more and more good work on this rather amazing topic that you've all come here to hear about tonight. Something that the more work I did on it, and I can really only claim to have been scratching the surface compared to what these people have done with their entire lives, the more I got into it, once again, maybe there is something about being 65 years old. The more I got into it, it got more and more complex. And the issues became more difficult to have really easy knee-jerk responses to, and forced me to actually sit back and go, now wait a minute, maybe I need to think about this from another perspective, to try to see at least 2 or 3 vantage points from which some of these issues and topics I might have thought were very simple and certain and straightforward actually become something that require more cogitation. And I'm grateful again to be here tonight with 3 people who know and always will know a lot more about this topic than I ever will. And actually, to begin, I think to sort of find an entree into this really interesting, really important world that obviously everyone who's here has an interest in, or they wouldn't be here. I think I want to ask David to tell us why he became somebody interested in this topic. Was there some event, some person, some cause that you connected with that suddenly made you think, you know what, maybe this isn't just a part-time concern. This is something I might spend a few weeks with, or maybe months or years, or maybe the rest of my life.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, for me, it was all by accident. I was having a great time running my consulting practice. I was successful. I was traveling the world, what many people would call a high-priced consultant. I had no particular knowledge or interest in whistleblowing, but then my wife came to me and said, there's some friends of ours that are in a very difficult situation. And these were people who are world-class medical researchers, but there was wrongdoing going on in the institution where they worked. And basically they were being squeezed out and hampered from doing their work. And so I got involved. I pulled together a little group of people. We gathered information and evidence. And I have to say, I thought this was going to be pretty easy because, I didn't consider myself a naive person. I'd traveled the world. I'd helped companies to understand some very challenging problems that they had. And what was going on here was so obviously wrong and so damaging to important field. I thought, we'll put the information to the senior people responsible, and it'll all be done and dealt with. And I was completely wrong. I was stunned by how readily and how routinely the senior management who should have dealt with this were able to just shrug it off, to cover it up. And the people who I call the bad guys are in more powerful positions today than they were at that time. So that was a wake-up call for me. And I should perhaps mention I'm an immigrant. I uprooted my family to come to Canada in 1989. I told them there's a better future here for our children, and there were career interests too for me. But and I came here in the belief that Canada was, as many of us see it, a very clean and respectable, well-governed country with decent people and an honest country. And I had no reason up to that point to doubt this. But when this incident occurred, I just saw a dark side that shocked me. And I thought, well, this is not what I signed up for my children. I have to do something about this.
A sub-question to that, though, and I'm pushing, I guess, on the motivation that pulled you into it in the first place. Was it the friendship the connection that you had with people who were blowing a whistle and being ill-treated, or was it the issue itself? Was it the justice or injustice that was being done on an abstract level almost?
I think a bit of both, but I think I was drawn in through friendship ties. But once I understood what was going on, then it was an imperative. This was something really bad that should be stopped, and it shouldn't be allowed to stand. And I think, having spent time talking to literally now hundreds of whistleblowers, it tends to be the same thing. You think this is something that is really wrong. It's against the public interest. It's causing harm. It may be causing lives, and you also empathize with the people who have put themselves at risk, just because they felt the same way, and they felt, I can't be silent and live with myself. I have to do something.
Sandy, you're, I think, a perfect person to go to find out just how widespread the problem is, because you've worked on 3 continents, I think, and worked in a number of situations dealing with people who are put in this very difficult situation. How widespread is it? Not just around the globe, but within individual societies?
From my perspective, it's everywhere. Everywhere where you have wrongdoing, you have people who try and cover it up. And what I've seen is that the people that stand up and say that's wrong, in whatever environment they're in, very often pay the price. As a police officer, you expect that. I would deal with informants. Sometimes we paid them, sometimes we had something on them, whatever it was, we'd get them to give information. And we knew and they knew that if they got caught, they might get beaten up, they might get killed, they might go flying off a building, and that happens. What really surprised me is then you come into the private sector, like David. I'm an immigrant. I moved to the private sector, and you saw people, I met people, I dealt with people who were just standing up and saying, this is wrong, my job is to say that's wrong. And they were getting called names that police informants were called by the criminal fraternity, and they were suffering horrible consequences. So from my perspective, the truth is it's widespread. It doesn't matter whether it's government or private sector, public companies, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. People that see wrongdoing and stand up to point it out, a very significant percentage of them suffer consequences. And really, we want to talk about people being able to stand up and say this is wrong, and the problem gets solved. None of us want to be here talking about whistleblowers and whistleblower protection, but that's the way the world is.
And when you say the world, I think we need some clarification there too, in that it's very easy to assume that this is the kind of thing that goes on in banana republics, where we know corruption is widespread, and it sort of goes with the turf. It's part of the terrain. But it's everywhere.
So as you heard in my day job, I do investigations, and I'm one of the people that takes whistleblower calls on care system for our clients. And another example is when we go and talk to management, if we're brought in to help, I find that in at least half the cases, management is quite often more interested in trying to figure out who the whistleblower was than they are in trying to solve the problem. And as an investigator, we're there to find the problem and solve it, and you can't get management away from, and we know that quite often we know who the whistleblower is, and they don't, and we're trying to keep them away from that. But there's part of it's a human nature thing. They're inquisitive, but also we know that people who've done things wrong have a reason for wanting to cover up what they've done. They don't want to get caught. They don't want to pay the price for their actions. But also management quite often is a problem. Sometimes management doesn't want to be the one who was in charge when this happened, or management doesn't want to be embarrassed, or management doesn't want bad publicity, whatever it is. Just as in David's case, this is a simple transaction. This is going wrong. We've told the boss will fix it because it's wrong. But people find all sorts of other motivations for not doing what we would hope they would do. So universal. It's human nature.
And I definitely want to get back to you being on the end of a call line that whistleblowers contact, because that strikes me as a very rich terrain that all of you know a little bit about, and I'm sure it's full of amazing stories. Probably not all happy stories, but stories that I think we need to get into. But I want to bring Anne into the conversation, and I want to do that by I guess finding out how to understand whistleblowing. I mean, I can think of movies in which people meet in dark alleys and envelopes are transferred and secrets are told, and that has a sort of romantic, almost a murder mystery kind of quality to it. That also, it strikes me as probably pretty cliche and not altogether real in every case. What's your understanding of what happens when whistleblowing occurs?
My experience has been that people don't identify themselves as whistleblowers. They often are people who are in their workplace, they come across something, they see it going wrong, they raise it. It's the reaction that starts them thinking, oh, there's more maybe here than I thought. It's the fact that they're suddenly put into a position where they're sort of defending themselves rather than the issue, so that can be part of it. I think, although the world is very complex and is getting more complex, I've always thought of whistleblowing as really simple. It is, in a sense, you're not a whistleblower if, and you don't even think about it, if you don't have a dilemma. The dilemma comes where people you are meant to report to or talk to or should do something about it, for whatever reason, you feel that's not an option for you. It could be because other people have gone before and you've seen what happened, so it's already starting to close off. It could be because they're sending you somewhere else, they're not dealing with it, all those things. So I think you're not really thinking about it very much when you find yourself in these positions. And certainly, as someone who trained as a lawyer, again, like David and Sandy, it's something that's always a little bit of a surprise there, because I was on an advice line where we gave early advice. So it's, what do you do tomorrow? I've got this, what do I do tomorrow? And often it can be the early stages of something, so you're helping them think about it. Sometimes they're coming to you when they're already starting to get this negative reaction, they're not sure what to do, and you're giving them some options. So it was always very practical about how to present it in a way that people can hear it, how to make sure you don't stay and get stopped. It's not, I think in the US system, probably where it came from, it was always seen a whistleblower is someone who goes outside to a journalist. For most individuals, that's the last port of call, rather than the first port of call. Or it's a backup. It definitely is there, but people don't think, they think about going to work tomorrow. They don't think about calling the journalist. They don't even think about calling the regulator. So I think that there's a lot of kind of misconception at the moment, or different conceptions around whistleblowing. The word gets used a lot in a lot of different ways. But I think of it really simply as, what's the problem? Who do you want to tell? What's stopping you? And most humans, so back to the sensibleness, they just want to say it and go home often. But something starts to unravel, or they'll take it further. I think that we've been interested over the years in the kind of psychology of people who take it much further, but in the end, that's just our curiosity. I think the real issue is around accountability and who ought to be doing something about it, rather than the whistleblower, in a sense. And I think that's what Sandy was saying and Dave was saying. You're looking at the issue and saying, there's clarity there. There might not be clarity about all the personalities, but why aren't people dealing with this problem?
Well, it is almost by definition. I was thinking about this. I was thinking about what we were going to be talking about this evening. That the sort of impulse to blow the whistle comes from a disorientation. That excuse me if I'm being innocent or naive, but it's like that's not how the world's supposed to work. And it's suddenly when you come to that realization, this is wrong, and how do you know how to do it? It's not something you've ever thought about doing before. The world's not supposed to be wrong. It's supposed to be right. And when you see it's wrong, I don't know what to do with it. And so I can see a certain desperation that comes from both the whistleblower in that case and anyone who has to deal with them, because they're confronting somebody who is disturbed in a way they probably have never been disturbed before.
I think the disturbedness can be heightened. I don't think people start off very disturbed. Most of the people that I've talked to sound very reasonable. In the workplace, there may be other elements that are there. By the time they're starting to have an argument and the focus is on them, it gets complicated. But often, again, this is where the legal training and a journalist training will be very similar. You kind of, you unpack it for them and you get back to what the issue was, and you can hear the relief when you get back to what the issue is. And the other thing I think that I've really come to understand is that whistleblowers are almost, the individuals themselves have expertise. So when they're actually involved in resolving an issue, and this is where organizations and regulators and get it very, very wrong. They're like, okay, dump it here and you go away. They often don't interview the right people. They don't look in the right places. Somebody is not so much a victim when they're part of the solution. And you can see that even in a case like the LuxLeaks case in Luxembourg, where 3 people have gone through a court case and a prosecution, 2 whistleblowers from PwC and 1 journalist. And because they had a lot of support, and because the European Commission and the parliamentarians gave them credibility, and there's been change in the tax system, the fact that they actually have been convicted, they know they've been part of something that mattered, and they were part of the solution. So again, it's not that they should have to go through that, but I do think that there's a real trick that gets missed in this process of is failing to involve people in the solution of the problem. So then it becomes an us and them very quickly.
I don't know that disorientation would be what I described. Many of the people I deal with are very frustrated. I think it's a fairly well-established fact that most whistleblowers have tried at least one other way to deal with the problem before they go through more official channels. And by the time they get to an organization like the ones that Anna worked for, or they end up talking to someone like David, they're probably a long way down the line, and they found out people don't want to do anything, people don't want to listen to me. Suddenly I'm paying the price here, so you find people are very frustrated. They don't understand why they're being ignored, or they don't understand why someone doesn't want to help them fix the problem, or worse, they don't understand why they're being threatened. I talk to people who they've lost their jobs, and worse, we know that whistleblowers suffer all these things. So mostly there's a sort of lack of comprehension, and there's a frustration, and some of the people we talk, I quite often have whistleblower calls on a Sunday night. They go back to work and they see the same thing going wrong every day. That guy is stealing, and I know he's stealing, and I know other people know about it, and it just festers until they get to the point where I think exactly as David said, they don't plan to do all of these things, but they just see this is wrong and I have to do something. And finally they say, whatever the consequences, I've got to do something. And maybe they call somebody who works for, the kind of organizations we work for. Maybe they go and talk to their boss, and their boss does something, but unfortunately that's not always the case.
Yeah, I'd like to add that from my perspective, a great many whistleblowers, perhaps the vast majority of them, get into trouble simply by doing what they see as being their job. They may have a professional obligation. They could be an auditor that stumbles across transactions that look faulty. They could be working in a hospital and they see things that compromise patient care. They could be in the police and they find that some of their buddies who are supposed to be going after organized crime are actually working with them, and on and on. So you could be an engineer and you're asked to sign off on some piece of construction or an airplane or something. So there are lives at stake, and they view it as simply doing their job, and most of them really don't feel they have any choice about it. And I have to say that I think many of them have no idea how serious the consequences may be for them. Because to them it's straightforward. This is a problem. It's a serious problem. It ought to be fixed. This organization shouldn't tolerate this type of problem. It's against their mission and their mandate. And so they launch into this. And I think they're naive in the same way that I was naive, in thinking how easily I would be able to sort out this first case. They have no idea what they're up against. And then afterwards, once they've been betrayed the third time, as they try and work through the official channels, they're beginning to become very jaundiced about the possibility of official channels helping them, and that's the pattern.
I think we should jump right into those calls once again. You all have experience of picking up the phone, knowing that somebody is calling to say, I have to tell you something that nobody seems to want to believe. And I'm hoping you'll believe me. I don't know. I'm making up the words, and I'm not the scriptwriter here. David, what's it like?
Well, I didn't take calls at all for quite a few years because I felt I didn't know enough to help people. And then I worked my way into it gradually. And I did this for about 4 years, let's say. In the end, I was getting calls at the rate of more than 100 a year. And I told people right up front that I can do very little for you. All I'm going to do is give you some information, and I'll give you point you some reading material, and I'll give you my take on your situation, and then you're on your own, because I don't have resources to do any more than that. But it was very disheartening because there were very few people that I could help in a material way that would change the outcome. In most cases, I was simply stripping away a lot of misconceptions about what they were up against. And for example, many people would think, oh, we've got an integrity commissioner, we've got a law, and I'd have to disabuse them of, what the likelihood was of getting any success there. So in the end, I began to feel like a doctor, where everyone that comes into their office, you can say, yeah, I've seen this before, I've seen this often, I know exactly what's going wrong here, and you're going to die. And it felt like that because I wasn't. We don't have the tools in Canada to materially change the outcome where we stand at the moment.
How much of the medicine you're practicing, though, as the person answering the phone, is also psychiatry or psychology?
Yes, there's certainly that part, and I have to say that I was astonished at how grateful people would often be. They would often say things like, you're the first person I spoke to that understands what's going on, or they would be very appreciative of, if they felt I'd been empathetic and heard their story. They're extremely grateful to be listened to and to get information that was relevant, even though it was very discouraging information. They felt, that's probably accurate, and that was a relief to them. And just to be believed, because there's so many whistleblowers whose families abandon them because the family's not sure if they've got a screw loose or made this all up, because everyone else is saying that this person's crazy, they're unreliable, they're a liar. When the family hears that from everybody else, they often don't know what to believe. So just being heard and being believed was very validating to many people.
You must sort of convince them that they're sane. I mean, they're doubting their own sanity, and you're saying, oh, that's not where you should be going this.
Yeah, I mean, what would I say to people like that? I think just the fact I heard them, and I could feed back to them what was going on. I could tell them what was going to happen next. Yeah, that was very validating for them.
And you've answered phones. What's it like? I mean, when someone calls, how do you determine whether they're telling you the truth or maybe just trying to pull off a scam of some sort?
Lots of good questions. I mean, I was a newly trained lawyer from Canada, arrived in the UK.
So if there'd be language problems.
Language. Yeah, good ear. I went to university in French, so I got to really listen carefully. And it was just as the new law had come into force, so nobody knew about it. And the Public Interest Disclosure Act was written by the organization that I joined. And they came from a consumer protection background. It was set up as a legal advice center and was registered under the Bar Council. So one of the things that was considered really important was, before the law came into place, because it had existed since 1993, was to create a safe space. You weren't disclosing anything by going and asking a lawyer for advice. So you created a lawyer-client space with the confidentiality that went with this. In the UK, the employment legal system, when it fit in, and this is the way the Public Interest Disclosure Act fit in, was within the workplace. So it covered every worker. So every civil servant was covered, everyone who worked at an NGO. I think the police had a little bit of, they said, oh, we'll give exactly the same, but they weren't considered employees. And then they switched that after a while. They said, oh no, we got to cover the police. And so it was, we were getting calls from all over the UK with all the accents. And it was early advice, because there are plenty of lawyers in the employment law system who could take the cases. And we knew that if people were taking cases, and you take a case when you said, I have raised an issue and I've suffered, so I've been dismissed, I've suffered detriment, and I'm seeking compensation or some sort of restitution. This was meant to be early advice. What's your concern? What do you do tomorrow? So it would range from concerns in the local care home. It would be, I learned a lot, we got calls from tree surgeons, we got calls from scientists, from academics. Some are better. I come from an academic family. They like to have arguments, so they were in busy arguments. It's like sometimes you need to get to the facts, not, you just present what the issues are. This is where I almost felt like, this is where you pretend you're a lawyer. You ask all those really good questions. So you're not treating it as a psychological issue. When people call you, they've obviously been worried about something, so they're calling at that time. Often you had to turn it around and call them back so that they'd be calmer, because they're ready to tell you a very long story, and you had to both not drain yourself but not drain them. I did find those of us who spent 2 or 3 hours as a counselor, in the end what people need is really good, solid practical advice. They didn't necessarily thank you after that, or they may not have even remembered you were one of the many they called. But some of the calls were just incredible, and I thought I'd throw one out there. And this is a person who called me, and I think he's my hero, because there had been a very big scandal in a baby baby cardiac unit in the UK, where there had been, and it happened before I moved there, and this was where surgeons who were operating on babies, which again, there's, success rate in that field is probably quite low, but the success rate of these surgeons within this unit was so low, and there had been an anaesthetist who'd raised the concerns there, and it had become a national scandal. It had gone from the hospital right to Parliament. And at the time, the fallout was that doctors were only struck off if they committed something, not omitted to do something. So there had been a big shakeup in the medical profession after that, because the chief executive of the hospital who'd failed to deal with it was a doctor and was struck off for failing to deal with something as a manager. But there was still a lot of issues around surgeons being the gods that you didn't challenge. So I think the anaesthetist who'd done this ended up working in Australia auditing, just getting the facts of surgeons, and he was blacklisted in the UK. The person who called me was 5 years later. He didn't remember and didn't know. He was from a northern hospital. He knew the story and a bit of the fallout, but as an anaesthetist, he remembered this person speaking up for patients. So what actually got left in the residue was, how can you stay silent? And he called, and he was basically saying there was a surgeon who was absolutely negligent. Nobody in that hospital would send anyone they knew to that surgeon, but of course there'd be people who would be referred, and did knee operations. The anaesthetist who called me said that he had to prepare everyone as if they were going through open heart surgery, because they would lose that much blood from their knee operations. And so he had done, and again, challenging surgeons, and there's all sorts of understanding of how power works in different cultures. And so it's not just a legal framework, it's the culture of something. You help people focus on the issue and you help them raise it properly. And he'd done a lot of this work himself, and he ended up going to the medical director. And he did it, and we can talk about Snowden later, but it reminded me when I listened to Snowden first talking, he said, I'm an anaesthetist, I'm not a surgeon. He could say with some professional clarity, I've never had to deal with anything like this as an anaesthetist, but surgeons should be looking at this. At one point, because it was a 2-year conversation, he called a lot, he said, because he raised it, and he raised it well, and he did get support from somebody within the hospital, but of course what he was doing was raising something no one else in that hospital had properly dealt with. So he was also challenging them in why they hadn't. The other anesthetists would say, well, I had family, and we knew but didn't know as much. So he felt ostracized. At one point he called me, this was in London, and said, I'm going to move to Canada. And I felt a real conflict of interest, because Canada could really use you. That would be great, but I think you should stay because you're a really great anesthetist and they need you here. So I was like, okay. And he ended up helping with the investigation. That doctor was not only struck off, but jailed. And he's now deputy medical director. And he's not the fellow who blew the whistle, is now deputy medical director. He's not known as the whistleblower, although he's now being made a freedom to speak. They've come up with some sort of funny title for someone for staff to go to. He wrote to me just last week and said, "You were the first person who said I was doing the right thing." And I feel like I just admire, I helped him through some of it, and I talked it through as a lawyer, and we knew what but it wasn't really about the legal framework. It was about presenting the facts, not sticking around, but giving people some time. It's a little bit like when you're jumping through hoops. It's a little bit like going up to somebody and sort of saying, especially I think when people go outside, so this is what regulators have to deal with. Somebody's finally going to them and they expect everything to happen now. And a regulator or someone outside is just getting the information. So we'd spent a lot of time managing people's expectations. That didn't mean you give time, but you follow up. But regulators or authorities need to understand who's coming to them and when and how to deal with it. But I think for me, that was a classic. His story, and Nick is still in the UK, was why I did what I did. It wasn't about the big cases. It was about the small cases that could become really serious big cases. But if you catch it early and people are given support, if organizations thought this is about our organizational learning, all of this is about organizational learning, and don't get into that, some of the people who come forward, they might be the ones you go, oh God, here they come again. Same one. That's the one staff will go to because they're the ones that get up and say what they need, and other people are shy. So unless organizations make it safer for the vast majority to come, they'll only get the ones that cause the trouble or do it in a way that's slightly annoying. But organizations are in the quote mature situation. They're in the powerful position, and if they don't get it, or they're deliberately covering up, people have to have an alternative.
I think in the case you're talking about, you're being a little too modest in saying he was the hero and you were not. And you should accept the compliment that he was giving you, that you made a difference in his life.
Yeah, no, and I knew about the professional duties he had. We worked with the regulators. We knew about the legal framework, and we helped with various steps. But he did most of that. But he needed that extra support to survive. And lots of people don't have his education, don't have his wherewithal, and we were doing that work every day with people.
Sandy, you say you still do this. You still answer phones, or the business you work for does.
So different circumstances. There's two kinds of whistleblower I talk to. So as part of our care team, then we have, lots of clients around the country who've decided they do want to have a whistleblower system, and they do want to create an avenue for employees and quite often other people to tell them when things are going wrong, and they want to do it in a professional way, and they want to deal with the problem. So those kinds of whistleblowers, quite often we hear the frustration, but we are generally at that point with the solution. So by the time they've called us, it's secure. We talk to them about anonymity. Do they want to identify themselves to us? Do they want us to identify them to their employer? What is it they want to say? We can guide them as to what are the implications of saying certain things. You could remain anonymous, but if only 3 people in your whole company have any knowledge about this particular area, then maybe just in doing this, you put yourself at risk, so we can talk to them about that. We try and understand from them, what does resolution look like for you? What do you want to happen? Which is quite often a really good question. Helps us to understand motivation, but it also helps the company. If a whistleblower has this idea that until the president's been fired, I'm not going to be happy, then right off the bat, they know that they're going to have some difficulty bridging their gap. So I get the same kind of reaction that David's talked about. They get relief and they're happy that they've talked to somebody. And then more often than not, unless we're involved in the investigation, I may not see them again. Sometimes I've done cases where we take the call and then I've gone into an organization and we start interviewing people. And sometimes very well, it's the 5 people in the line back there. I'm not going to pretend I don't know, right? Who's so-and-so? I may have spoken to you on the phone. I'm playing a game. I don't know you. And then I get them in the room and they say, my God, you're here. It's so amazing. Management did something. And their 2 biggest fears are, number 1, that no one will do anything about what I've told you. And second, their fear is that I will suffer retaliation. So those are good calls. The other kind of people I deal with are more like the kind David has been, and since I've got involved in, advocating for whistleblowers and things, people who are whistleblowers are coming to me with similar stories to David, where they've tried a whole bunch of things have gone badly wrong. There's a guy who first started calling me about 8 years ago, and I think I'm the only person that talks to him. He's got a really interesting story about a company that's committing fraud, and I've directed him to authorities, I've directed him to media, and he just can't get anyone to listen to his story. And I told him, you keep calling me, I want to keep talking to you. I worry if in that case I'm talking to him about, his how are you doing? I'm trying to be a good ear for him. And another guy who called me recently, who's a police officer, and he found corruption in his police force, and then things started to happen, and he's had 2 drug warrants, search warrants executed on his home. He's being absolutely persecuted. And that guy I'm talking to, are you okay? Is your family okay? Have you got a plan here? Is this really a good idea, as David said? Do you know what your exit from all of this is? Is this worth the fight? If it's your family and your kids and your livelihood and everything, maybe moving's a better option. So depending on who you're talking to, it's a different kind of experience. But what really, in the first kind of call, I'd like to think that I'm part of the solution. We're here, we're professional, we know what we're doing, we know what we need from you, we know how to treat it, we know exactly who's it going to go to, we can explain to them how it will get dealt with within their organization, and that's a positive conversation. And on the other side, this is a bit like the pre-call, so Anna's talking to people before they've told people in their own company. David's been dealing them with the rough end. They've already started to suffer the consequences. So there's 2 different kinds of conversation that I end up having.
I think this is a really good time then to try to get inside the head, I guess, of the whistleblower, to try to understand what motivates them. I mean, is it this sense of blatant injustice that they're confronting a wrong, as I said earlier, or is it a sense that they can make things better, that they are? Again, I don't want to put words in your mouth or thoughts in their minds, but David, can you? What is it that makes a person become a whistleblower?
Well, I think most people who do this simply view it as doing their job. Now, there may be exceptions, but that's the usual pattern that I see. But having said that, not everyone who has that job and that role and that responsibility will do this.
What motivates that person as well?
Right. That's right. So the point is that I believe there are people that it's just part of their DNA, that unless they feel that they're doing the right thing, they are not able to respect themselves. And I remember a good example of this. I was doing in-depth interviews with whistleblowers, so we spoke to about 40 of them. And that was a learning experience for me, because normally I had quite short interviews with people over the phone, but here I was meeting with people, spending maybe an hour and a half getting into the story. And I remember one case where this was one of the RCMP whistleblowers, the people who disclosed that the RCMP was robbing its own pension fund to pay for, golf trips and all this sort of thing. And he had suffered really badly. And the day that we, the day that we interviewed him, he was having a bad day. I'd seen him better, but that day his shoulders were down, he was slow, he was dragging himself. And I asked him, would you do this again? Which we'd ask everybody. And what he said was, in spite of all the horrible things that happened to me, and it was horrible. I mean, his whole identity was tied up in the RCMP. That was his life. And yet now he couldn't see the uniform without feeling sick to his stomach, so his life was destroyed. He said, as bad as it's been for me and my family and so on, there would have been consequences to going the other way. And I don't think I could have lived with myself. I think that I made the right decision, and I would do it again. And I think that, to me, that's the essence of what many whistleblowers will tell you for whom it's come out badly. Now, there's others who'll tell you, I'll never do this again if I know what was happening. But I thought it was very interesting in his case that he'd thought about it and he'd come to that conclusion.
The ones who won't do it again have probably suffered, inconceivable repercussions for just having tried to do the right thing. Sandy, you must have stories about that, about the kinds of
Well,
attacks people are subject to?
There are lots of stories, but to give you one that I know a lot about, and one of the reasons I got involved in this, when I was working for the Royal Hong Kong Police, one of my jobs was liaising, doing narcotics and organised crime work around the world. So we were liaising with the Mounties and with immigration in the Canadian High Commission in Hong Kong. And after Tiananmen Square, there were lots of people leaving Hong Kong and coming to Canada. That's a well-known fact. But there are a lot of crooks, organised crime, triads, drug traffickers, people like that I was targeting coming to Canada. So we're investigating someone and we see they're coming to Canada. The first thing we do is let Canadian immigration and the Mounties know this guy doesn't have a criminal record, but this is how he makes a living. And this individual, Brian, started getting interested and learnt about organised crime in Asia and started looking at targets and building up information and sending reports back to Canada. And then he found that there were people in the High Commission in Canada who were working with the bad guys. So he reported it, and he was taken back to Canada, and he was fired, and he was hounded, and he has surveillance, and his mail opened, and he was a career diplomat, basically. And his whole career and his whole self-image was destroyed. He got mental health issues. He suffered for depression for 20 years. He's still a friend of mine. I still know him, and he's now, 20 years later, just coming out of that situation. But that's not the worst end of it. That's quite typical. Mental health issues, hounding. You can be ostracized in the workplace, like kids do. But it can be much worse than that. You can be blackballed in your whole industry. If you're a federal government servant and you blow the whistle in Ottawa and people find out, which is, we'll probably hear later, is quite a common thing, you can be blackballed for all federal government jobs in Ottawa. So now you've got to move, and you've got to move your family, or maybe you can't make money anymore because that's what you do for a living. Look at another case that we're seeing in the papers right now. There's a lovely CBC report about Montreal Police. And these guys found out about corruption. Some of them reported it some time back. And there's a CBC article called 10 Years of a Living Hell. And IA, the internal investigations guys that they passed the information to, were not investigating the corruption. They were fitting up criminal cases, faking evidence against the whistleblowers. Look at the Charbonneau Commission, where one of those guys who was a whistleblower was threatened by Italian mob. Someone came and said, you understand that this is dangerous for you and your family. You know who these people are. You know who we are. You know what can happen. So some of those are very dramatic. A lot of the cases we deal with are nowhere near that. A lot of them are fairly standard transactions about HR and violence in the workplace or theft or fraud or stuff like that. But when you get to the more serious issues in some environments, it can get really nasty. I still meet people in my law enforcement and sort of crime-fighting world who still badmouth that guy. Oh yeah, he's a liar, he's mad, he's all of these things. That they created so much negativity. They created a whole story around how he was a liar and a cheat and he didn't know what he was talking about. That was the power of what they did to him.
His kids were bullied at school. Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah.
As I say, it gets more and more complex the further and further you get into it. I mean, what you expect is never what you ultimately end up seeing. Curveballs are being thrown at you from all directions at all times.
There's also just two things I would say, though, because there is always a risk when you only talk about the bad stories. And one of the things, because there are good stories, and they do come out well, and part of it is to say, you know, in Canada, things can go that badly. It doesn't happen just in other countries. And Canadians have to wake up and smell the coffee around these issues. But you don't kind of encourage people to speak up in the public interest for other people by saying, and you will suffer. And that's one of the things where I worked with fairly charismatic director used to say, well, you'd really not have made Christianity one of the world's religions by saying you have to be a martyr. So part of it is to say, actually, even in the Canadian context, when you have the stories that show that people did the right thing, it could have been really hard, but the issue got addressed, and they may have still suffered. Like that anaesthetist who I talked to, the anaesthetist who had blown the whistle originally, was drummed out of the NHS, did go to Australia, did suffer. This guy remembered the right thing. And what I feel has been happening since I first started in this area in 2000, we used to do a lot of training, and you'd say, what do you think of the word whistleblowing? I never had to do any training. That was my workshop. Because you'd have everybody say, do you like the word? Do you not like the word? Hate it. Grass, snake, traitor, betrayer, all the rest of it. Snitch. Yeah, these are all my British names. Yeah, so I can't remember. Tattletale. Now, by the end of 9 years, when we had the law and we had done a lot of work, and it really was the civil society that led and pushed, because power will go in and out of this. Governments will go in and out of it. Companies will go into it when they have a problem, and then they'll go back out of it. When things look good, why protect them? Like democracy. It's working, and suddenly it's gone, and things have been eroded, and we weren't paying attention. So with the whistleblowing thing, I think one of the things that has started to change is that we're talking about it much more as a collective issue. And for me, the issue isn't so much the psychology. Of course, if someone gets shafted and has a terrible time at work, the psychological and emotional and financial damage is huge. Early cases that Public Concern at Work did, when we told them about someone who did the right thing, though it was tough, journalists said, did they lose their job and are they still married? Yes. Yes, they kept their job and they're still married. Well, that's not a whistleblower. They wouldn't run the story.
This is so weird. Again, I said at the beginning I thought it was all simple, and then it became complex. But I sort of want to believe, maybe it says something about my character, that I like the underdog. I want to cheer for the little guy. I want whistleblowing films all to be directed by Frank Capra, and maybe Jimmy Stewart should play the guy all the time.
So I would talk to bankers and say, do you want the nurse or the staff at that hospital when your child or wife is going under the knife, or your husband, to blow the whistle on that surgeon? Yes. Doctors, you're making a lot of money. There's a lot of fraud going on at that bank. You're putting that money away to send your kids off to private school. Do you want the people in that bank to be raising concerns? Yes. Do I want them here? Not so much. So I think part of it is changing. I'm the Canadian who's spent 20 years away and is going back away. These are the Scot and the Englishmen.
It's
who
a
are the
reciprocal
Canadians
arrangement.
I was like, who to name the Canadian? And I thought that I got it because I was kind of Canadian in that slightly smug way Canadians had. It made sense to me. I saw this job and was like, yeah, you help people who see something which could cause harm to other people, raise it, and they need, if their manager or their boss, then there's a regulator, right? You go to the regulator, and if the regulator, and eventually we have a free press. And so it all actually still, I don't know if I'm just naive, I'm going all around the world, I still think that makes sense. And I still think in the end we need journalists, because in the end we need to know. This is about the public's right to know as much as my power to speak up or my free expression. And this is about making sure that accountability works. And accountability isn't scapegoating. This is, I run this business, so I'm accountable, I'm responsible. I am the minister, I'm responsible. I'm the surgeon I'm responsible. So it's about those who have responsibility, who ought to deal with it and want to deal with it, dealing with it. And I think early research was a lot around the psychology of these crazy people who, despite all the bad news, kept going. And that is really interesting. But what I think is really happening now is we're having whistleblowing on massive scales on global issues of tax running around the world because we don't have those accountability mechanisms even in place. And we've lived in a system of, over the last 20 years, my working life, of a kind of light touch regulation. So regulators who want you to come to them but won't necessarily go out and examine anymore. Unions have been pushed back. There's a lot of roots that people used to have that aren't there. Now, I'm not saying we were all whistleblowers 25 years ago either, but I think we're sort of seeing that people are taking on these roles, whether they wanted to or even thought they were, and they're suffering in ways that matter to us and should matter to us. And the suffering won't be so great if we actually think it's our issue, not just their issue.
I want to perhaps egotistically dwell for a while on the role you give to journalists as perhaps being the great, the saviors of society here. I used to think, and I was told that journalists were like the forerunners of historians. They were the ones who were going to create history and give the sort of raw material for the guys later on. But you're sort of telling me that journalists are actually paralegals.
No, there are backup, they will shed light. So
They
when-
do the investigation that perhaps should be done by policemen or by, I mean, they ask questions that aren't being asked by the people who should be asking.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting members of WIN, are optimistically named, is a Serbian media platform. And this was a couple that were fired from their state-run paper for blowing the whistle on conflict of interest and censorship, set up Pištalka, which is called the Whistle in Serbia. And for me, what's so fascinating is they are becoming a first, line of call, but what they're doing as journalists is investigating as journalists, but they're doing it in a way that they can then do a story, and all the papers who won't touch it will pick it up because someone else has done all the hard work, so they get the publicity and the public knowledge. And they're also got enough information they can hand it to the anti-corruption agency, and they can hand it to the prosecution. So they're making all the bits about what is a new democracy, recovering from a trauma. And this little NGO, I went and did some training with the anti-corruption agency staff, and they were like, oh yeah, everyone trusts the Pištalka because they do the proper investigation. And then when the anti-corruption agency doesn't deal with it, they have another story.
Right.
So yeah, some of those lines are slightly being crossed, but in other parts of the world, this investigative journalism, which is still not paying anybody, is the way, and they are taking a lot of the risk, and whistleblowers are taking a lot of the risk. What we need to do is also help shift the risk back to the responsibilities that ought to be taken by these other players in our society.
I want to hear from David and also Sandy on journalism and where it fits into this equation.
So I was showing these guys earlier on that journalists are increasingly interested in and involved in and working with whistleblowers. We've got the big examples, like the Panama Papers and stuff, but what I showed them was some research I did that showed how often the word whistleblower is used in Canadian media. Between 1990 and 2000, not much, and then there's a very steep curve. So journalists are really beginning to understand this, and we see a lot of whistleblower stories, so the whistleblower retaliation piece is understood, and the public are hearing about that. That's not really what we want to talk about. We want to talk about why not do it the right way. But we see people turn to journalists, as you've just said, when nothing else works. And in fact, with that case that I talked about with Brian McAdam, it was handed over, and there was a Mountie investigation. There were 4 different RCMP officers investigating that case. The first 2, I was interviewed by the first 2, and both of them became whistleblowers because of what they were being forced to do or not do about the investigation. And they went where? They went to the media with their story. And it's the same concept. This is wrong. How could this be? I need to do something. The Mounties won't do it. The whoever else, the CERC committee won't do it. Let's try the media. Maybe the media can make something happen. And sometimes they can. So I'll give you another quote that I like to give. One of the Toronto Star journalists that worked on the Panama Papers story, and I was talking to him about whistleblowers. And he looked at me and he said in a public room, he said, I think whistleblowers are the highest form of human life, because he'd seen people putting their own lives at risk and their own welfare at risk for the greater good. And not all whistleblowers are like that, but most of them have a lot of that in them, and some of them a great deal of it. And so journalists are another place where they sometimes go, but journalists have the ability, this is about public awareness. Journalists have the ability to tell everybody, whistleblowing is simple. If somebody knows what's going wrong, listen to them, don't shoot the messenger, investigate the problem, solve it. That's a good whistleblower story. Someone reported something, we investigated it, we sorted out the problem. That's a really good whistleblower story.
Journalists sort of serve as surrogates, really. Like they
Yes.
become the whistleblower absent one step.
Yeah, I'm sure David has a slightly different...
Well, first of all, make the observation that very, very few whistleblowers even consider going to the media. And I think research shows that only maybe 1 or 2% ever go to the media, even when everything else has failed. So the stereotype of a whistleblower immediately rushing off to the media as the first step is completely
Does that
false.
also mean that 99% of the cases never get heard
That's
by
right.
anybody outside?
That is absolutely correct. yeah.
That's a frightening
Right.
statistic.
So what you're seeing when you read stories in the media is just the tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg. The other thing I should say is that for many people in power, the media is the only thing they really fear. You see this all the time. Senior bureaucrats brazenly riding out a brief storm of outrage over something that they've done, and they do this routinely. What will shift them is sustained public outrage, and that's achieved through sustained media coverage, and the media continuing to dig, and not just chasing off on some other story at the drop of a hat. And so organizations like GAP in Washington, D.C., their process for dealing with cases, which they've used since 1977, was it, is absolutely standard. They have a legal campaign and they have a public campaign, and the two go together. And lawyers like to feel that they're going to solve the problem in the courts, but public exposure and public watching what the courts are doing helps enormously. And while we're on the media, I think what I'd like to see journalists do more, and I'm not saying this is easy, is follow through. I think they should follow through more on stories that they've covered to see what's happened. I think they should follow through on their sources and see what's happened to them. And in that way, they become more of a force for change and less of a kind of gadfly that pricks you here and there and then goes away,
Okay, enough of this sidebar in journalism. Let's get back to whistleblowers per se. And all three of you are advocates for whistleblowers. You think that they perform an important function in our society, and that we're much the better for having them, I guess. And make the case. What do whistleblowers do?
Well, I think they cut through a lot of our own red tape and our own sometimes ways of seeing things we need to learn. So again, the word whistleblowers, most of the people I know wouldn't necessarily call themselves whistleblowers, but people who just because it's sort of like it's a strange word, I'm Anna.
There's never a whistle involved, is there?
And they hardly
I think
ever.
of hockey when I think of whistles.
And I think one of the things that I think in all of this, what I'm really hearing and what I'm seeing around the world as a much more of an acknowledgement, even from the whistleblowers themselves, that they are part of a bigger picture. And I think that the fact that they've taken that route, sometimes because they are cutting through something, it's the thing you don't want to hear. It's the noise around. You're trying to get a job done. It's bad news, so it's always going to have. I mean, we tried always, and we still do, and the organization I do. It's about the risks and opportunities and presenting it in ways that people can hear. Now, if they're not going to hear, don't wait. Go to the next place. But part of it is getting the advice and help to raise it properly. People, those ones. It's like going into a room where I would do training, and the one person in the room, you could tell they absolutely hated the idea of whistleblowing. This went through, local authority counselors in Wales had a hard time with this. They'd been there 40 years, and this just went against everything. Once they got it, they were the people that were most for it, because these are people who will tell you bad news and wait for you to hear it, and wait till you look past all the other things that are going on at that issue. And those are the people that make you stop and look. And it's really hard sometimes if the Titanic's going and there's things happening. Well, but you'd still, if you don't listen, the risk is the Titanic sinking. And it's not that you should stop everything every time. It is sensible. But you take a bit more time with the people around you. And so I think for me, whistleblowers are just out there like the reminder. They're the people who just remind you what you were there for in the first place. And we all need that in our workplaces. And it'd be better if they were part of our workplaces, not people that have to go elsewhere. And then we spend our whole time ostracizing them, and we fail to look it up. And most of the scandals, we've talked about this, the scandals aren't the initial issue. It's the cover-up that will just sink organizations and people. It's not, sometimes that issue, if they just dealt with it, it was important to deal with it, but it's the fact that they don't deal with it, and it gets worse and worse and worse.
And they don't see the fact that a wrong has been pointed out and can be corrected. That could actually be good for business. It could be good for society. They don't weigh it in the way that is the thing that's most important. What's important is covering up the bad things that might have happened. The bad news
too.
It's a knee-jerk. We talked about that earlier on today. it's a strange knee-jerk reaction quite often. So you can understand the perpetrator. That person over there is going to get me in trouble. If I can deal with them, I don't get in trouble. That's a fairly logical transaction. But then I tell the boss, and the boss doesn't want to hear me. The rationale is not necessarily as clear, and a lot of it is defensive. I just don't want to deal with this, or I don't want the problem to be on my watch, and that's much more difficult to understand. And that's why we get some of the reactions. I'm sure David has got some thoughts on that.
Well, I want to know, David, you although you come from Scotland, you have been in Canada and done a lot of this work in Canada. Give us a report card. How's Canada doing?
Oh, Canada, well, the good thing about Canada is we are decent people. You know, we're... it's our institutions that are failing us. And in Canada, I like to say to people, Canada's known around the world as the Titanic of whistleblowing legislation, because we have the system that has most badly failed and most publicly failed. 10 years ago, during an election process, we ended up with a whistleblower law that's extremely badly written. It's been terribly badly enforced or administered, and the result is that there's really no protection in Canada for whistleblowers. And I'll give you some numbers that might help illustrate that. The law that we have is claimed to protect workers in the public sector, the federal public sector. That's roughly 400,000 people, you know, getting on for 500,000. The law has been in place for 10 years. An important part of the law is that there's a tribunal, and that's the only place that whistleblowers can go to get a remedy. In other words, some compensation, some rectification of what's happened to them. In the 10 years, not a single whistleblower has completed the tribunal process to be awarded a remedy. In the 10 years, only 7 people have been even allowed to go to the tribunal because there's a gatekeeper function that is keeping most of them away. So 7 cases have gone to the tribunal. No one has completed the tribunal process. The defenders of this system will say, oh, well, these people settled, they got a settlement. But those settlements are basically people cutting their losses when they realize they have no chance in front of the tribunal. And just throw another little wrinkle there. Our Integrity Commissioner, which is another part of this whistleblowing system, he has 2 ways of referring a case to the tribunal. There's 2 different sections of the law. One section asks the tribunal to give the whistleblower a remedy. The other section asks them to give a remedy and to deal with the aggressors, in other words, to sanction the aggressors. In 5 out of 7 cases, the Integrity Commissioner has used Part A, which means that there's no consequences for the aggressors. In other words, the Integrity Commissioner has used his power to shield the people who took the reprisals from any kind of consequences at all. They're scot-free. So this is a system that's not working very well.
It sounds like, I mean, we were talking earlier about how whistleblowing might not be the right terminology. A couple of other terms come up in my mind right now. We also have earpluggers. And then we have ammunition deflectors, people who throw the attack right back. And all of these are part of a complex sort of psychodrama that most people, apparently 99% of people, don't even get to hear about any of these cases. It's a secret world. How do we make it more public?
Well, one of the things that we did, David and I we worked with the Canadian Standards Association. We said, okay, we don't have a law, what can we do to make things better? So we worked with the Standards Association to develop a guideline that said, this is how you can do this. This is how to create a good whistleblower system. This is how to set it up internally. This is how to handle whistleblowers. And we created this document for businesses or any kind of organization to take. That was a first step. In reality, there's lots more things that we can do. I'm going to let David and Anna talk to some of those other things.
I think something that's very important to mention is that just in the last couple of months, there's been a very, very important development. If we were having this discussion 2 months ago, we'd be talking about a completely static situation where we had a bad law, it had been badly administered, we had 10 years, people like ourselves, civil society advocates, beating our heads against the walls of Parliament, trying to get change and being completely shut out, not even allowed to testify.
That almost sounds like what you were saying 5 minutes ago.
Right.
But it's better now? This is good.
Well, what's happened is that there's a section in the law that calls for it to be reviewed after 5 years, which is very sensible. It's a new law. We should take a look at it, see if it's working well, improve it. So that should have happened in 2012. People like myself were advocating at that point for a really thorough and comprehensive review, because we thought that Treasury Board would set up something that was rigged and that would be very superficial and come out with, you know, the answers they wanted. But they went one better than that. They didn't have the review at all. So we've been waiting for another 5 years, and I think most of us had kind of given up hope that this would ever happen, when out of the blue, the Treasury Board asked one of the parliamentary committees, the Government Operations Committee, to review the law. And so I got a phone call on a Friday evening from Alan Cutler, who said, I've been asked to testify to Parliament. So what's it about? I don't know. And, you know, we dug in, we found that the 5-year review had actually been initiated. So at that point, people like myself and Sandy and so on, we just mobilized, and a whole lot of people who were really despairing of anything ever happening leapt into action, and we have been working with the committee to make sure they have good witnesses testify to them. They're listening to experts from other countries, and I have to say the committee is doing an excellent job. You know, they have dug in, they've assigned more time to this once they realized how complex it was. They've called experts, 4 different experts from other jurisdictions, including Anna, Australia, Ireland, and the US, of course. And they're working extremely well. And people have commented that in most of these committee meetings, you see a lot of partisanship going on. That won't be a surprise. You can tell from the questions which side of the aisle people are on. That's not happening in this committee. They've dug in, they're working in a very non-partisan way, and they're actually calling back these foreign jurisdiction experts for a second time. So this is extraordinary, and it's really quite exciting. So there's a little, the door is cracked open a little bit, and a lot of us are rushing into to establish a beachhead. Now there's a long way to go, because let's say the committee isn't too overwhelmed by the complexity of the current law and the complexity of their task. Let's say they're able to cut through that and write a really good report. Then it's up to the government to decide what will they do with that. And right now that doesn't look very hopeful, because if you look at what the government is doing with access to information, which was a campaign promise, and a very clear and simple campaign promise that they're backing away from, and this is a very similar issue, then you have to wonder, will they pay any attention to the committee's report? But nevertheless, we're in motion at the present time.
I want to stick with that emotion, the sort of hopeful thought that you've introduced into the conversation here. But first I want to just say that I do want to leave some time for questions from the floor. So I'm going to just ask a couple general questions that anybody can answer, and then we'll have time before 9 o'clock to involve some of your questions. And as I say, I want to sort of keep on that hopeful note. Basically the gist of this conversation has been not necessarily happy. And you are 3 people who advocate for whistleblowers and what they mean for society, but you've also been saying it's a tough world. None of this is getting heard. I mean, we're hearing a bleak sort of picture, so I want to give you each a chance to turn it around. And you've already told the nice story about the person who did not go to Australia but ended up staying behind. So you could be the 3rd person with a good story. Let's start with Sandy first. Tell us a good whistleblower story.
Okay, so I deal with many cases where the initiation of the investigation is a whistleblower report. And I've dealt with many cases where a whistleblower report is made to management. So a lot of the ones I do are about fraud or corruption. Some of them are quite serious. So somebody reports, I just have to be very careful about what I say. So no names, no pack drill, but imagine a large, very well-known company in Canada, and there is a lot of fraud in the procurement part of the company. So people are using the company's resources to buy stuff and basically stealing money. And a group of people get together and decide to blow the whistle, and several of them drop out because they're scared of the consequences. The whistle is blown. Very senior management starts an investigation. Senior but middle, you know, imagine an organization that's got lots of parts, so the controlling part up here, and I'm being deliberately vague, says, the board, let's say, says, you're going to investigate this. You're going to bring someone in from outside to do it. We start our investigation. Management does everything they can to obfuscate, and they spend their whole time trying to find out who's the whistleblower. But the whistleblowers are not uncovered. The fraud is uncovered. The people, one of them confesses, some money is recovered. The problem is dealt with. And although we know that in the middle of the management there's some people that didn't believe in the whole process, in that particular case, the problem has been dealt with, and the whistleblowers are happy. They said, this is happening, somebody listened, somebody did something about it, and the problem is solved. And many cases are like that, but there's enough of the bad cases for us to be talking about why we need to change the channel. And Anna's right, we don't want to tell all the war stories. There's another one that I've just put up. I like to look for positive whistleblower stories. I put them on my LinkedIn page. There's a government body in Australia that takes whistleblower reports, and they took a whistleblower report about the management of a particular government body that was stealing funds. It was investigated. They were charged. They went to jail. Those are good whistleblower stories. There are lots of them. But once again, you don't necessarily hear about them. You hear the gory, about the gory fraud, the gory cover-up, the gory retaliation against the whistleblower. You don't necessarily hear about where it's done properly, the way we want to see it work. So now I'll let David have a go.
Go for it, David.
Okay. Well, I think that in the role that I was in, I was hearing all the horror stories, and people didn't come to me if things went well. And from my experience as a management consultant, I've seen some wonderful and some awful organizations. And I believe that in really well-run, competent organizations, this sort of stuff is dealt with often without even a whistleblower policy. It's
a healthy organization.
It's a healthy organization. I'm not saying don't have a whistleblower policy and all that. You absolutely should have that. But I think there are organizations where issues are surfaced by employees, they're dealt with, the person never even thinks of themselves as a whistleblower, there's no repercussions, and you just move on. Now, I like to think that these are organizations out there, but as we've discussed, human nature somewhat mitigates against that people can become defensive and so on. In terms of successes, I tend to look at cases that are still in play, where there's still the possibility. Hopeful, that's right, hopeful. And so I'd mentioned the Schmidt case. And Ed Schmidt is a former employee of the Justice Department. He worked in an area where their job was to review new laws and regulations for compliance with the Charter. And the Charter requires that. And their job was to tell Parliament, if a law or regulation stood a significant chance of violating. Well, it turned out that the Justice Department had effectively neutered that part of the process by applying an absurd standard of proof. And so for the past, I think, at least 10 years, maybe longer, they have been effectively disregarding their legal obligation to scrutinize new laws and regulations for compliance with the Charter. That's a big story. And Ed very courageously and strategically exposed this. He took the Justice Department to court. He was very fortunate that the judge seemed to realize that he was that the department was trying to crush him. And the judge seemed to think that we should hear from him. Ed, the case is ongoing. Ed himself is in New Zealand helping them to work on similar issues to do with protecting, the integrity of your laws and so on. But the case is ongoing here, and I'm optimistic that with the great lawyer he has who's sitting here, that we'll have a successful outcome.
Anne?
That was just a case I did pick up on from far away, so it is one of those interesting ones. I think for me, yeah, there's every reason for us to think this is really difficult and we should walk away. So either we've got a kind of, we should all go to bed and it's too difficult, but we've got something deeply optimistic. I find that there is so much happening around the world. Yes, it's very busy, but from my point of view, working with the Whistleblowing International Network as civil society, if this isn't picked up and understood and talked about by civil society, because it is a social issue, and the politics will follow if we demand it. Okay, that might be hopeful too, but I believe that. And I've seen that happen. Then for me, this next generation that is dealing with both technology and communication in a different way, which has its great sides, has its negative sides, we can't afford not to do this. There's so much happening around the world with our resources. Canada's at the heart of that, and our planet, that we need to be dealing with issues as issues. And we can't just be stuck in whether we like the way it's being told, or whether, we need to know if it's true. And any, for whistleblowing, if sometimes they're very relieved to be wrong, if they've only got a bit of the picture, thank God, and so we need to understand that too. People don't necessarily come because they want to be right. They want to make sure it's looked into. So I think for me, the positive side is I see so much happening around the world that's picking away at something that for a good 10 years that I was in the UK, I would come home and say I worked in whistleblowing, and I was like, what? And even in the UK, I was like, what? What are you doing? For the last 5 years, it's been crazy busy, because this issue is coming up again and again, because people are taking on, as individuals, risks for the collective that we need to start to take on ourselves. And we need to demand to know. We don't need to wait for a whistleblower to come and prove what we kind of already suspected. So I think one of the things about whistleblowing that really hits me is that it does actually cut through cynicism and inertia pretty damn quickly sometimes.
One last quick question before we open for questions from the floor. And this one's a pretty personal question. We've heard you expand upon what I think we can mostly agree is a pretty important issue, and one that we're all pretty well on the same side of. It's a good idea to have whistleblowers. It's too bad we need them, but since we need them, it's darn good that they're there. Personalize it. Would you whistleblow?
I have actually, yeah. When I was a police officer, I blew the whistle on my own team. It was a drug squad, and I did a case where I knew something was wrong, and I called the corruption people on my own team. And so I would always. The only thing that would detract me from that is if my family were suffering.
I feel like we could spend probably 3 hours trying to unpack that brief statement you made just there, but you were plainly aware, being who you are, of the possible consequences in either direction.
Yes, I was, yeah.
And do you feel good about having done that?
Yeah, and everyone that worked for me knew that if there was anything going wrong, they wouldn't have to worry about the corruption police. They'd have to worry about me first. I believe that strongly in this. Just like David, I brought my family here for a better life and to do things right, and so I absolutely do. I could see a situation where I could get ground down, but my absolute instinct would be to do the right thing and blow the whistle. I'd probably be a lot smarter about it now than I was in those days, but yeah.
David, you sort of implied that journalists were surrogate whistleblowers. You are too, no? I mean, you're functioning as an assistant, as an aid, as a support system. That sort of makes you an ally, if not an actual co-conspirator there.
Yeah, and I think that, my friends and family worry at times whether I might become a target. And, this isn't
Do you
Russia.
worry about that?
I try not to. I don't think it's very likely. If it did happen, I would feel vindicated. It shows that I'm being effective.
I was actually I was actually wondering though whether you were worried about your family worrying.
Well, it bothers me that they worry, but my wife worries. It's one of the things she does. Bless her soul. I worry less. And we're not in Russia. Just to get it in perspective, you know, I'm not going to get a bullet in the head from a professional hitman, I don't think, not in Canada. But, you know, maybe the tax auditor might turn up and start turning over the last 20 years of my consulting business records, or, you know, who knows?
Again, you know what's happened to other people in the past, so you can come up with examples of what might happen to you.
There are ways that one can be got at. And for sure, if it would happen, as I say, I'd be thrilled. I'd feel maybe I made a difference, that they feel it's worth bothering to retaliate against me.
Anne, would you blow a whistle?
I think I have so many people that I know I could seek advice from. And I also know that, so I don't feel alone. And I know that I've done it in smaller ways. I don't think I've been faced with the seriousness in my own workplace. I've worked for places that's all we do, is try and do these things. We challenge each other a lot. They're not easy places to work. We're not always easy people. We take on some of that, the fight. But I think I have that network, and I think that I would want to make things better. So I do think it would be strategic and it would be tactical. So I don't feel like it would be such a shock, and I'd feel like I was, you know, so it's not that I would think I would feel concerned about. I do worry about my family worrying that I'm too busy and I'm not there for them. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is when you start a little club that nobody wants to be a member of. You know, and that was what I was part of for a long time. Was you know, it was kind of nice, a little interesting, weren't really sure what I did, certainly really didn't want to be part of that. When I started the Whistleblowing International Network with these 5 founding members, we had lots of interest because we'd always had the interest. But now I get lots of people wanting, even some that I'm like, no, you can't join. You know, this is a civil society. You are part of the other side. We can talk to you, we'll work with you, but you can't be in the club room. So that, to me, is a sign that things are changing, that people want to join us is the weirdest thing that I've experienced in the last 15 years.
Can I say just briefly before going to the floor that it's both heartening and inspiring to hear the 3 of you give that answer to that question, that you either have or would blow a whistle. It gives me hope for the future. Questions from the floor? There's a microphone that will come. Yep.
Recently, we've just in Canada passed the SEC Act, which allows for $1.5 million to be paid out to a whistleblower. The states are looking at a $3 million payout, 30% payout in terms of the Frank Dodd Act. How do you think that's going to affect whistleblowing in North America over the next few years?
I will say something, but go ahead.
Okay, I've got permission from Anna to play my stuff. So one of the reasons we've had more awareness of whistleblowing is because of the SEC and the OSC. But the reality in the world I live, and I think in the world that these folks live in, the only people that pay whistleblowers are regulators. And whatever the argument for that or against it is, most of the situations I deal with, companies can't afford to pay whistleblowers. And mostly, I think our experience, and I'll let these 2 speak for themselves, is that generally you don't need to pay whistleblowers. So whilst that case has been made, the AMF made the completely opposite decision. They decided not to pay whistleblowers, and they gave their reasons for it. So it's been great for raising awareness. I think that to the extent that the conversation is about paying whistleblowers or not paying whistleblowers, it's misguided. It's misdirected the conversation. The conversation is about why whistleblowing is good, what happens to whistleblowers, how we can do it right, how we can protect them. So that's my 10 cents on it.
Well, I've lived in the States last year, and you're not allowed to say you can't make money on things, and that's part of the way things work. But I think there's a couple of things I would say. One is within the sort of whistleblowing world, you know, anything that would compensate someone for a position in which they've put themselves at risk is not necessarily a bad thing. And we're talking about Securities Exchange Commission. It's about business. It's you know, it's sort of, that's the way that world works. In Europe, and I think generally the idea of paying is basically, okay, we won't protect you, but you could make a lot of money. It's still very rare, those payouts. They're big, but there are very few cases. There's lots of barriers around who would actually get those payouts. And I was in a room with the head of the whistleblower unit from the SEC, so the Dodd-Frank position, and he was very clear that most people wouldn't get the money, still came forward, still wanted the issue addressed. The biggest protection for people wasn't offering them money, was actually telling them what the hell you were doing with those issues. Because it's the not knowing, and that sends people and gets them into other trouble. So the rewards issue, I think, I'm not a moral high ground, but it is that's a transactional whistleblowing, and that's just not the world most of us live in. It has its place, it's doing something. I really worry it's about we've gone through a period of no regulation. We don't have an international regulatory body that deals with finance, so we pay people because we don't have the resources. And there's some regulators that do that as a shortcut to doing, in my opinion, their jobs.
There's a piece of legislation in the US called the False Claims Act, which goes right back to the Civil War when unscrupulous suppliers were selling lame mules and ammunition that didn't work and rotten food to the Civil War armies. Surprise, surprise. So not having the resources to go after these people, the False Claims Act deputized citizens to take on the powers of government and prosecute people like that and to get a share of the proceeds. And that law was revived maybe 15 years ago approximately. And it's been spectacularly successful in many ways in recouping money. But it's interesting research done. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the industries that has suffered the most at the hands of the False Claims Act. And the government has retrieved literally tens of billions of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry. There was a study done of whistleblowers who were behind those disclosures. And what it revealed, fascinatingly, was that they were, essentially all of them were what I would call whistleblowers of conscience. They were people who'd come forward, tried to do the right thing, tried to get the problems fixed, and were going down. They were desperate. They were suffering all the usual reprisals. And then they found out about the False Claims Act. And then they were able to hire top-notch lawyers who would work on contingency. And some of them made large sums of money, tens of millions of dollars. They all said that the money didn't compensate for what they had gone through. And the point is that the money was not a motivation. They didn't even know about it. And the reason for the success of the False Claims Act is not because it motivates people to come forward. They're going to come forward anyway. It's because it shifts the balance of power. And so the whistleblower goes from being a victim of a vast corporation to having the power to go after that and prove the wrongdoing and prosecute the corporation.
Another question?
We've heard a couple phrases tonight tossed around, and one that's, I suppose, pretty new is dance like nobody's watching, write an email as though you're going to be called into a deposition. And I'm just wondering on technology side, is that going to, or have you seen it making any changes for whistleblowers? Is it easier for people using encrypted software, having paper trails, more people coming forward with this? Even newspapers now putting on their front pages, if you have leaks, please come to us. So on this issue of the press and whistleblowers. So do you see this making a change, or is it still fundamentally a human issue of people trying to weigh what are the consequences to me?
I think that's one for you, Anna, right?
Oh, God, yeah. A couple of things. So I have a colleague in Italy who came to our first meetings around Whistleblowing International Network from Global Leaks. And so there's these young techie guys, and they seem to be more men, but there are quite a few women as well. And for them, it was like, well, we'll solve it all because we'll all be anonymous. And that has quickly changed. That community has become much more savvy, and they are learning how to also not only encrypt. So, you were supposed to, when you licked your envelope, it was supposed to be private, and you're still not supposed to open it. So it should have all been encrypted from the first place. So we've got this strange thing that we're demanding what we were never given. And there was actually lobbies that made sure that it wasn't encrypted, 15 years ago. So I think that they're learning a lot, and so they're coming now that they need the laws and the frameworks, and there's also a real human need to unplug. If you're going to do serious investigations, you need to have no one trace you, so there's all that happening too. I think technology and this sounds so lame, but the way people are communicating, particularly young people, that feels dangerous to us, and to me in lots of ways, but I also have been in lots of parts of the world where that technology is empowering people, and they are coming up with really amazing ways to change it. I've seen older investigative journalists coming back alive with these young guys, and they're working their heads around both the technology as a tool, not an answer, and those investigative skills working for them. It's now coming into local authorities in Barcelona and in other parts of the world where citizens can use technology to report on corruption, and it can come back, so it's an empowering thing. But there's a lot of risk around technology right now, and so I think it's changed the momentum. That's where I feel very tired a lot, because I don't understand it, and I expect other people to explain it, but they're working it through. So I think technology is a tool. It allowed a directness of in exchange. It has empowered a whole generation. It's also the tool of repression, especially the way we're using it and allowing it not to be a private enterprise, a private issue for us, and that we control our data. And so there's a big fight going on right now about controlling information worldwide. And you've got the right to know and the access to information and technology where it's already out there, and encryption, and that's working its way through, and we haven't got the systems yet. But to me, it both changes everything and sort of seems really familiar too. We used to have anonymous, which was the brown paper envelope under the door. Now we've got anonymous. There's always traces. And one of the things that I was it was inculcated in me when I first started in this area, 15 years ago, was we're trying to offer an alternative to silence or anonymity, because anonymity creates a host of other things, but it's also the greatest protection when there is no protection. So I won't go against it, but I see that there's problems with that, and we haven't worked our way through it. But
I'd like that a little bit, because what you said about tools, I'll give you a really good example. So the care system takes surface mail. Nobody does that anymore. It takes email, because exactly what you said, everyone knows email's dangerous. Don't use email. Though we've developed a secure system, it takes phone calls. We get quite a few phone calls, and it takes them on the web. And on the web system, there's no way even for us to know, so our clients never know. The other advantage of the web, so that's the most popular method. And the other advantage to the web is that allows them to get a login code so they can go back in and they can see what's happening on their complaint. And it allows us or the employer to write questions. So very often a whistleblower says, there's this problem and you need to do something about it. And we say, well, you know what, you mentioned this guy, but there's two, do you know which one? Or we need other evidence. So it gives us a secure means to communicate with the whistleblower, where many of the things that we deal with are a one-way transaction. Unlike Anna's, where they were secure, Anna's team worked for them, we are an intermediary with their employer. So we get often one kick at the can. So technology is now allowing us to have a secure, ongoing conversation with the whistleblower to get more evidence, and also to pass back on to them to the degree that we can what's going on, which is powerful for the whistleblower.
Yeah, I'm a techie at heart, so I love playing with technology, and I follow what happens. And it's clear that technology is advancing at an incredible rate. It's providing some incredible tools that are going to be used by both sides. And so if we think of the encryption as an example of that, where the government wants to be able to read all our emails so that they can catch terrorists, but we don't want that because we want our privacy, and whistleblowers and people like that especially don't. If you listen to the proceedings at some of the conferences of people who work in this field, there's a tool called Tor, T-O-R, which is used by many people around the world, often activists in dangerous countries. And people who are working on that describe it like an arms race, where they're trying to keep ahead of these totalitarian governments, and they'll notice at some point that the traffic from a certain country just does a nosedive because they've figured out how to detect the Tor traffic and shut it down. So then they introduce a countermeasure and it goes back up again. And and those people are very conscious that there's lives at stake here, that if the regime not only is able to block the traffic, but is able to break the codes and identify people, then that's going to cost lives. I'll also throw out a couple of other examples where it's changing the scene. It's very dangerous these days to do anything illegal or violent in a public place, because someone will have a cell phone and video you, And we see the enormous impact that's had on policing, where violent police measures are being recorded and they go viral. I'll give you another example. When Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, it was thousands of pages. He spent hours beside a Xerox machine photocopying this and smuggling it out in packages, over weeks and months. These days, it's all in a thumb drive, and you walk out the door, and you can leak gigabytes of information, as has been done. Gigabytes of information very easily put into the hands of journalists or whoever. So technology is a tool that's changing things, and as I say, it's being used by both sides.
I was going to say actually that's sort of the elephant in the room in the technology question is the biggest superstars, the poster people of whistleblowing are in fact people who drop gigabytes of information from all the governments of the world right onto the plate of everybody. And is that a problem that those people are the people we focus on as that's whistleblowing?
There's no doubt that some of those cases, Snowden and the Panama Papers, although we don't know who the Panama Papers whistleblower or blowers here are, they've advanced. So in what they've achieved, I'd like to leave Snowden aside because of the national security issues. But if you look at the Panama Papers, people in my world and others in this room have looked at the offshore industry for years and years and known it's a problem, and those guys have just blown it wide open, and government corruption and money laundering, all those things. So I appreciate what that impact, the impact they were trying to have, the impact on changing laws and rules about corporate secrecy and stuff. But they've also made whistleblowers perceptions, like public perceptions and a lot of negative perceptions, they've made those perceptions change. And that big manifesto we got from the Panama Papers whistleblower, this is why I did this, has helped people understand. The question I get asked most when I talk about whistleblowers, isn't it true that mostly it's petty stuff, they're just doing it for revenge, it's that people have this perception of whistleblowers as doing it for their own personal means, and that's very far from the truth in my experience, and probably for these guys too. So anything that throws light on whistleblowing in a positive light and shows what we're talking about, to me, is a great thing, on top of the benefit of the case they were reporting on.
Another question.
My name is Musa. I'm a student here at the Ryerson School of Journalism. And like you said, I might not be welcome in the club, but I would definitely like to help out. Mr. Hutton, you touched on it briefly. He's talking about how you'd like to see journalists follow through with whistleblowers. My question to the floor is, Mr. Hutton, whether you'd like to expand, or if you two would like to answer that, what can journalists do to solidify or synthesize relationships with whistleblowers? Thank you.
Well, I think your generation probably just don't see it as a barrier. This is about a flow of information, and some of the complications may come up later as you learn more about how other structures work, and you need to track into that. But from my point of view, what I see is in the leaking platforms that have been set up and those who've been involved, it hasn't necessarily, for the regular papers that have been part of that, it hasn't necessarily changed a lot for those journalists that are still not meeting the whistleblowers, so they're not as aware. That is changing. The younger journalists like the Süddeutsche Friedrich Obermeier and his colleague who got the Panama Papers, they've been part of consortiums running around the world talking to other journalists. There are two things. They see it in their self-interest to work with other journalists, which a lot of journalists, the older school of journalism, like the older school of lawyers, you got the big case, you're the big star, you don't share. It's impossible with gigabytes. It's impossible. Those stories are global cross-border stories, so they're working together. And I think one of the things is to change this narrative. Not all whistleblowers are going to be journalist sources. It actually helps journalists in their jobs to have strong whistleblower protection so people are doing it properly, because as a journalist, when you get that source, you're going to be asking, who have you told? What did you try and do about it? Well, no, I've just come to you. And then there's a whole bunch of issues for that journalist. Some of the journalists I talked to are very honest. They're like, whistleblowers are a pain in the ass. They don't let you, they come with a story they're going to tell. I don't see the story they see. I do it this way. So a lot of what you can do is have more events where young journalists talk to some of the people that have done that. We're organizing that, having cross-professional meetings where people get to hear it. I don't want journalists to be Journalists won't be and shouldn't be just focused on helping a whistleblower for 10 years, but not to revisit it, not to talk about whether and how it should change so that somebody who has suffered shouldn't still suffer, that's a journalist story. There's sometimes a story about whistleblowing when there isn't that sexy case. So I think if journalists are more aware that part of what's happening is their trade is changing for lots of reasons. They're using platforms to get stories because they don't have the resources to go out. So again, it's a shortcut. But actually to see it more as we all are in this together, and we need to see the stories as being bigger than just the small story they have. That would be a huge step in the right direction.
I think it's a really good thing if journalists launch campaigns. I think impartiality and always telling both sides is fine, but I think that there are issues that are clearly of public interest where a journalist or a newspaper can quite legitimately launch a campaign and pursue it and put resources into it. And you see that at the moment with The Guardian. It's working on environmental issues and putting significant resources into that. I'm reminded of the case of the thalidomide children in the UK, where one of the newspapers there decided on the decision of the editor to launch a campaign. And they just kept on that relentlessly for years. And eventually they were able to get justice for those people. And it would never have happened otherwise. And I think that's a very legitimate function for the media to undertake.
There's a way as well, I think, in which the interests are the same. That those are not strange bedfellows. When a journalist is asked by a court or by a politician to reveal their sources, that is something that needs a whistle blown on it. I mean, and that is a way in which there's a commonality of interest that is very important. I mean, when those kinds of challenges are made, exactly the kind of overturning of reality we were talking about at the beginning is happening. You're asking me to do something I am not supposed to do. That's wrong, and so the sort of harmony of interest is very apparent. Another question.
Yes, I'm too old. I'm too old to be a student here. Oh, wow. Harry Markopoulos wrote to the Securities and Exchange Commission 8 times trying to expose Bernie Madoff. The role of whistleblowers in securities markets and financial markets is very well known. It's a well-trodden path. For the benefit of the recent immigrants in the panel, we've had the asset-backed commercial paper fiasco in this country. We've had Bre-X, we've had Sino-Forest go from $6 billion to zero. TD Bank banked Minnie Madoff and Sir Alan Stanford. There's a long track record here, and I'm delighted to report that the Alberta Securities Commission and the Ontario Securities Commission have created websites, which is so 1997. Lipstick on a pig, or a concerted effort at a real problem. Can you provide some enlightenment? Where we go from here?
Not that you're cynical, Kim, right? So, what I've seen over the last, let's say, 10 years is that the role of whistleblowers and whistleblowing is coming into the public eye, and it is being seen as more of a tool than it has been in the past. So I don't pretend to have all of the answers to all of those issues, and let's be clear, those two security commissions don't do anything in concert, right? So we've got all sorts of other problems. Not all of that is at the door of whistleblowing. What I believe is that if we can continue to show people what whistleblowing is really about, destroy the myths, break down the myths about who whistleblowers are, and work together to allow them to do their job and feed information to the people that could have dealt with those. Look at the cases that could have, like, where were the whistleblowers with the Volkswagen pollution thing, right? Where were they? There's plenty of other cases like that. But now look, recently, there's a very large American bank whose name I won't mention, but it's been in the news for upselling clients and giving them stuff. And all the whistleblowers that came forward were apparently fired. Well, now we've got the CBC in this country looking at some similar kinds of issues, and suddenly people are talking about these people need protection, and they've got a hearing. So I'm not saying that we are here because we know that there's an enormous amount to do and a lot to be fixed. But what I am saying is I do believe that we're seeing an improvement, and we need to keep moving in that direction. If we can get people to develop understand whistleblowers, develop good systems, and help people do the right thing, then we can cut to the chase on those. You know, there's a lovely story that I think came out just before the review about the Phoenix system, where apparently there were people who talked and tried to talk to the government about the Phoenix system, and the government didn't want to listen, and now the government is paying the price every day, and all of those hundreds or thousands of employees who've really suffered terribly. And so stories like that can come out and show, as Anne said, if we do this at the beginning, if we trust whistleblowers, if we give them the right opportunity and we protect them, we can stop those things from ever getting as bad. So it's just another tool, but there is no more effective way of dealing with these kinds of issues than having someone talk to you about it early on and jump on it.
We're talking here about very, very powerful and wealthy institutions with their hand in the till in various ways. And it's not restricted to, finance. This happens in all kinds of organizations. You need to have real power to combat that. And on paper we have that. We have an integrity commissioner who's an agent of Parliament, who can only be appointed by agreement of the Commons and the Senate, and can only be removed the same way, and have a similar status to the Auditor General. This agency has all the powers of the Inquiries Act, and so if they get to hear about these types of situations, they can go in and investigate to the nth degree and write a report to Parliament about it. Now that would seem to me to be a good thing. Unfortunately, this agency doesn't seem to be working, because in the 10 years that it's existed, it has only found 13 cases of wrongdoing. And many of these are, in the scheme of things, pretty trivial. I'm not saying they're completely trivial, but they're just not in the same ballpark as the kind of issues we're talking about here. So we have, on paper, an agency that has the power to combat the type of crime that you're talking about, and is not using it, in part because it's a terribly badly written law, and partly because the people who are running the show have no intention of creating waves, and partly because because the law does not really recognize the existence of the private sector. It has nothing for the private sector. So it wouldn't be a huge leap forward to write a law that would work, and to put someone in charge of running the show that actually had the instincts and the courage to go after serious wrongdoing and expose it.
Can I make just 2 quick points? I think what you were saying about these security regulators and what's been happening in the private sector. There's a whistleblower who also went to the SEC, and he gave the money back. He was awarded, and he said, I had to work so bloody hard to get them to even take this case. I'm not taking the money. This is where I get really passionate, because the whistleblowing is about the public interest, and it's about getting the information to the right place. Where I get really angry is when the right place doesn't act, who has power. The individual doesn't have the power. The journalists can reveal and show. They cannot investigate. So if you have regulators who are not doing anything, then that makes me angry. If you have, and this is where we come in, because if we're not demanding that, then we're just waiting for other whistleblowers. It's crazy. If we're looking at Snowden or anyone else, and if we go, okay, well, we have to look, even Snowden says, test me, probe me, look at the information. That's what I'm doing, is giving you the information. That's our job. Our job to demand that the institutions that we say have responsibility do their job. Otherwise, it is pointless, and people are smart. They do not go if it doesn't work. If they're going to get money, they might go, because at least they'll get the money. But they usually do that in a kind of half, it's not the reason. It's because we need something to be done. So, this is where I then say it's up to us. And this is where civil society has to play this space, and it has to cover the private sector and the public sector. It has to cover the institutions that have responsibilities.
My main job here is usually to be the timekeeper, and I think this is the last question.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline, and I'm a journalism student here at Ryerson. And I'm just wondering, how do you think whistleblowing ties into free expression in Canada, and how can we as citizens protect it?
Well, so I'll start for you folks while you do the thinking, okay? There's lots of different ways of looking at whistleblowing, and I come at it from a very practical point of view. I use whistleblower information, I investigate those cases, I talk to whistleblowers. You can come at it from a legal point of view. You can come at it from the point of view of civil society and doing the right thing. And I think that ultimately, another way to look at it is that we should be free to express these things. We've got people in countries like Canada who are allowed to stand up and spout, unpleasant ideas that target groups and do all sorts of things that most of us in the room are saying, well, that's not right, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. But we understand that freedom of speech allows you to do that. So now look at whistleblowing through the same lens. Somebody is not being hateful, not being negative, they're trying to be positive, they're trying to do their job, they're trying to help, and they're standing up and saying, excuse me, but you need to know about this, this, and this, and they're not being given the opportunity to do that. So there's a very easy way to tie free speech in this country to whistleblowing. The remedies, I think, unfortunately, lie not in trying to change our freedom of speech law. They lie in education, awareness, in laws and in systems, and in educating the people in power as to how you deal with the whistleblower. So whistleblowers do have the right to stand up and speak. The question is anyone listening, and what happens to them? So it absolutely is about free speech. It's just not quite that simple in what comes next.
We live in an incredibly interdependent society where everything we do our safety, our health is dependent on other people doing their job well. Whenever you get in a train or a plane, when you pop a pill, when you eat your food, when so many times when you go into a hospital or an institution, our lives and our health are dependent on other people being able to do their job well. And we have millions of people who are involved in those processes, who see what goes on, and who are fully aware when there's problems. And they just need to be allowed to speak up safely. And reporting a concern, reporting wrongdoing should never be wrong. It doesn't matter what kind of rules of confidentiality and all this sort of thing exist. If something is wrong, reporting it should never be wrong. So those are kind of simple principles that we could try and work towards. The implementation of that becomes difficult, but I think the goal is quite simple.
I think sometimes it's harder in a country where there's a lot of assumptions about, you don't notice what you have until you don't have it. So certainly what I've seen in the last, 5 years is that the issue of whistleblowing protection is being linked as the public's right to know very clearly. So David Kay, who's the Special Rapporteur for the UN, wrote a report very recently, and it was his second report as UN Special Rapporteur that linked whistleblowing protection and journalist sources and free speech. That hasn't been always a connection we've made. We've had journalists doing their jobs, and we've had kind of a sense of checks and balances, which I don't have any. I think that's great. We may have to change the checks and balances a bit. That's some of that, and we might not be as far apart. But when that goes, you know the link. So I think for this generation, some of that is going and has been going for a while. So in the last government in Canada, and I wasn't here, gagging of health scientists, closing down of information collecting so that people have information, the right to know. Freedom of expression is also having the tools to be able to express, having access to information. So it may not feel so obvious to you now and in this world, but to me it's right around the corner. And when you're not in Canada, you're kind of going, come on, wake up. I mean, David, I started talking to him in 2005. He's like, what are you doing in Ottawa, staring and shouting at our parliament? And he's like, where are the Canadians? And what are you doing over there? And I was like, okay. And it's like, well, it's Ottawa. It's far away. We don't think about it. We got our democracy without having a big fight. But it will go. just the same way. We have to have that fight. So unless we see it as important, we don't fight. So this stuff about, I'm sorry to, I mean, I do it all the time, but we're not just good because we're innately good. We are able to be generous because we have space and resources. We are not tested in ways other countries are tested. It's not good enough to think we're nice.
Bravo. I hope you'll indulge me if I secretly confess a not very secret thing about me. I love meetings that end at 9 o'clock because I can say, oh, you can all go out and listen to ideas. So now's the time to do that. But before I ask you to do that, please join me in thanking first the Center for Free Expression for hosting this event, and then the three panelists who did a marvelous job. And I guess that's it. See you next time, which I hope comes sooner rather than later. Thank you.